They say that the sense of smell is the anchor of memory, the one hook that never rusts. I am inclined to agree, though my memory has become a treacherous thing in these twilight years. A library where half the books have been shelved in the wrong sections. But the smell that remains absolute. It is the scent of ozone. That sharp metallic tang of heated vacuum tubes, mingling with the damp rot of a lionized winter and the sour reek of my own unwashed wool sweater. Even now, 80 years later, if a light bulb burns out with a pop, I am instantly back in that attic on the Rue Saint-Jean, shivering in the dark, waiting for the invisible world to kill me. I was 21, though I felt ancient, withered by a fear that had nothing to do with bullets and everything to do with frequencies. I was not a soldier. I was a student. I belonged in the lecture halls of the University of Lyon, where the air smelled of chalk dust and old paper. And the only conflict was a spirited debate over the Cartesian dualism of mind and body. In the university, problems had solutions. Logic was a straight line. If A, then B. If I studied the syntax of Goethe, I would understand the German soul. That was the ordinary world, a place of sunlight and stone courtyards where I believed that reason could tame chaos. The war, I quickly learned, had no use for Descartes. In the attic, the equation was different. It was a claustrophobic geometry of angles and shadows. The space was barely large enough for a cot and the table where the transmitter sat, a black metal box that hummed with a malevolent energy. I called it the Beast. To the Alliance network, it was just a Mark XV transceiver, dropped by parachute 3 months prior, but to me, it was a living thing that demanded to be fed. It was November 1942. The fog had settled over the Rhone like a dirty shroud. I sat huddled over the receiver, the headphones pressing my ears against my skull, listening to the static. It sounded like sand pouring onto a tin roof. Beneath the static, buried in the atmospheric filth, were the voices. Not human voices, but the chirps and whines of Morse code, a digital language spoken by ghosts. My hands were shaking. They often did. I tried to apply my academic discipline to the tremor, observing it as if it belonged to someone else. It didn't help. The cold in the attic was biting. It seeped through the floorboards, rising from the unheated apartment below where the terrified family pretended I didn't exist. I was terrified of the Germans, yes. The Gestapo headquarters at the Hotel Terminus was a place of nightmares, a factory of pain. But my true fear, the one that kept me awake when the exhaustion should have claimed me, was of the machines. The radio direction-finding vans. They prowled the streets of Lyon like sharks in deep water, their rotating loop antennas sniffing the air for the electromagnetic scent of a clandestine transmission. They were impersonal, mathematical, and flawless. A ghost in the machine. They didn't hate me. They simply calculated my coordinates. A drop of water fell from the rotting beam above my head and struck the rim of the bucket I'd placed near the table. The impact was soft, wet, and rhythmic. It hit the metal again and again. The leak had started 3 days ago, and in the silence of the curfew, it had become a metronome counting down the seconds of my life. Then the signal changed. Through the headset, the static parted. A clear, sharp tone cut through the hiss. It was the preamble from London. High speed, high priority. My pencil hovered over the pad. The training took over, the muscle memory that MI6 had drilled into me in a country house in Surrey. I stopped being Anton Dubois, the philosophy student who loved Rilke and dark coffee. I became a conduit. The dots and dashes arrived in a torrent. I transcribed them automatically, my brain lagging seconds behind my hand. Groups of 5 letters. Nonsense to the uninitiated, but as I wrote, the patterns began to emerge. I was decoding in real time, a dangerous habit, but I couldn't help it. The message was massive. The pencil snapped in my hand. I stared at the jagged wood. I knew the rumors, an Allied landing in North Africa. But this was the coordination data. Troop movements, timing. The Germans were shifting divisions south, preparing to occupy the free zone, to suffocate what was left of France. London needed to know what the Wehrmacht was moving through the rail yards at Perec. They needed the eyes of the Alliance. I looked at the transmitter. To send this acknowledgement, to transmit the intelligence we had gathered about the troop trains. I would have to be on the air for 20 minutes, maybe 30. The rule was 5. 5 minutes before the triangulation teams locked you down. 5 minutes before the vans converged. 30 minutes was a suicide note. I sat back, the breath rushing out of me. The refusal rose in my throat like bile. I couldn't do it. It was irrational. It was illogical. No intelligence was worth this certainty of capture. I was a boy who wanted to read books and drink wine in a free country, not a martyr to be broken in a cellar. I looked at the skylight blackened with paint. I could leave. I could burn the codes, smash the tubes, and slip out across the rooftops. I could survive. The water dripped into the bucket. A perfect, maddening beat. Cowardice, traitor, patriot. I reached for the heavy brass key of the transmitter. My finger hovered over the metal, and then I heard it. The sound was faint at first, muffled by the heavy oak door of the apartment building 3 floors down. The front door opening, not the polite latch lift of a resident, but the forceful shove of authority. Then the boots, hobnailed jackboots striking timber. They were heavy, deliberate and ascending. I froze, my hand still suspended over the key. The headphones were still on my ears, whispering the urgent query from London. But the world had narrowed to the auditory geometry of the stairwell. First floor. The boots paused. A murmur of voices. German, hard consonants that sounded like stones being crushed. Second floor. They were coming up. The rhythm was terrifyingly steady. They knew. They must know. The direction finders must have picked up the receiver's leakage, the faint oscillation of the local oscillator. I had been careless. The steps hit the landing below the attic. The wood groaned under the weight. There was a pause, a silence so profound it felt like the air had been sucked out of the universe. They were standing right outside the trapdoor to my world. I stared at the handle, willing it to stay still. My heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird desperate to break the cage. The silence stretched, agonizing and thick. I held my breath until my lungs burned. Then, the boots turned. The heavy tread moved away from the attic stairs and towards the apartment on the 3rd floor. A fist pounded on wood. A woman screamed a sharp, jagged sound that was immediately cut off by the slam of a door. They weren't here for me. Not yet. It was a raid, but a random one. Or perhaps they were looking for Jews or communists or just money. I exhaled, the sound shuddering out of me. But the relief was instantly replaced by a cold, crystalline clarity. I was living on borrowed time. The credit had run out. If I didn't send this message now, amidst the chaos of the raid below, I never would. I looked at the key. My mentor, a crusty old telegraph operator in London named Davies, had told me once I was no longer a student. I was a weapon. I pressed the key. The contact closed. The transmitter sparked. A tiny blue arc of electricity that smelled of ozone and danger. I tapped out the call sign. Lysander. I had crossed the threshold. The silence of the attic was broken. I was screaming my existence to the enemy, shouting in a language of pulses and voids. The response from London was immediate. A quick chirp of acknowledgement. They were listening. I began to transmit the data. The rail schedules. The tank numbers. The sheer volume of information was staggering. My hand flew. The wrist flexible, the fingers rigid, finding a rhythm that was trance-like. For the first 3 minutes, the airwaves were clear. It felt deceptively easy. Like a seminar on logic where the premises align perfectly. But war is not logical. At minute 4, the jamming began. It didn't start as a wall of noise, but as a subtle encroachment. A low hum like a wasp trapped in a jar, underlining my signal. The German operators at the monitoring station in the suburbs had found me. They were waking up. I increased my speed. The sweat was running down my back now, cold and itching. The hum grew into a screech. They were sweeping the frequencies, looking to smother my signal with raw power. I shifted frequencies, a prearranged hop to a backup channel. For a moment, the air cleared. I hammered out the details of the Panzer Division moving through the Gare de Vase. Then the voices came. I had the receiver set to monitor the bands, and I heard them. The German direction-finding teams. They weren't using code. They were using voice, confident in their supremacy. The voice was calm, professional. A technician doing a job. He sounded like a man ordering coffee. They were closing the net. I could visualize the map in their command center. The lines of bearing intersecting, forming a smaller and smaller triangle over the St. Jean district. Over my roof. I kept transmitting. The jamming was fierce now. A cacophony of wails and grinding metal sounds designed to break the concentration of the operator. It was an auditory assault. I had to filter it out, to hear only the pure tone of my own transmission and the faint, rhythmic confirmation from London. I glanced out the small, grime-encrusted skylight. The street below was a canyon of shadows. But then movement. A black vehicle, boxy and ominous, turned the corner at the end of the street. It moved slowly, without headlights. On its roof, a strange, circular frame rotated lazily. Look, it was here. My hand didn't stop. It couldn't. The intelligence was incomplete. I was describing the artillery placements now. Below, on the street corner, I knew there was a young boy, barely 16, pretending to fix a bicycle chain. He was my spotter. His signal was a whistle, a specific, jaunty tune. If he whistled, the street was clear. If the whistling stopped, I strained my ears, listening past the electronic screaming in my headphones, past the thudding of my own blood. Faintly drifting up from the street, I heard the whistle. The melody was light, innocent. Then it cut off, abruptly, not finished, just severed. A second later, the headset exploded with a new signal. It wasn't the Germans. It was London. They had intercepted the German tactical chatter that I was too busy to hear. The message decoded in my head before I could even write it down. I looked at the black car crawling below. I looked at the unfinished message on my pad. The logic of the university was gone. There was only the terrible, simple math of sacrifice. I kept my hand on the key. The coordinates required precision. A single digit wrong, and the Allied bombs would fall on a French schoolhouse instead of a German rail yard. My fingers became separate entities, detached from the terror seizing my chest. They danced on the brass key with the muscle memory of a pianist, not a soldier. Below, the heavy thud of car doors slamming shut echoed up the stairwell. There was no stealth now. They knew I was here. They simply had to reach me before I reached the end of the message. I heard the front door of the building give way. It was not unlocked. It was kicked in. The vibration traveled up the spine of the building, through the floorboards, and into my chair. Heavy boots on timber. 1 pair, 2, 4. They were shouting, their voices distorted by the walls. Harsh guttural commands demanding residents to open up. They were ascending fast, skipping steps. 2nd floor, 3rd floor. The distance between life and death was closing, measured in meters of vertical space. I had 3 groups of numbers left. My instinct screamed at me to run, to tear the headset off and bolt for the window. Every second I stayed was a second of head start lost. But the invasion relied on this. The boys on the beaches would rely on this. I forced my hand to stay steady. The rhythm could not falter. A faltering hand signals panic, and panic signals a mistake. The boots hit the landing outside the attic. The handle of my door jiggled, lugged. A heavy shoulder slammed against the wood. The frame groaned in protest. I tapped the final digit. I waited, an eternity of static. Then, the signal came back from London. A single clear acknowledgement. Received. I ripped the headphones off. With one violent motion, I yanked the quartz crystal, the heart of the radio, from its socket and shoved it into my pocket. Without the crystal, the machine was useless to them. They could not tune it to our frequency. I grabbed the Webley revolver from the table, not to fight, but because it was the only weight that anchored me to reality. The door hinges screamed. A boot heel smashed through the upper panel. I stepped onto the rickety chair and pushed the skylight open. The night air rushed in, cold and wet, smelling of river water and coal smoke. I hauled myself up, my elbows scraping against the rough frame. As my legs cleared the opening, the attic door below exploded inward. A burst of automatic fire stitched a jagged line of holes across the floorboards where I had been sitting moments before. Wood chips sprayed the air, but I was already gone, rolling onto the wet slate of the roof. I did not look back. I scrambled up the pitch of the roof, my shoes slipping on the rain-slicked tiles. I was no longer a student of the Sorbonne. I was a creature of the heights, a gargoyle brought to desperate life. A beam of light cut through the mist, swinging wildly from the street below. It swept the tiles inches from my feet. I threw myself behind a chimney stack, pressing my cheek against the rough, soot-covered brick. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird, loud enough, I feared, to be heard over the rain. For hours, I navigated the skyline of Lyon. I moved through the secret geography of the resistance, leaping across alleyways that dropped into black voids, balancing on gutters that groaned under my weight. I utilized the trables of the air, the hidden passages known only to the chimney sweeps and the hunted. The logic of the city streets, with their grid lines and intersections, meant nothing here. Up here, survival was a matter of friction and balance. I finally slipped through a dormer window in the Croix district, kilometers away, collapsing onto a mattress in a safe house that smelled of stale tobacco and fear. I lay there shivering, unable to warm myself. The young man who had studied philosophy, who believed in the rational order of the universe, had died in that attic. The man who woke up the next morning was something else entirely. He was a vessel for codes, a ghost who lived in the spaces between radio waves. I look out the window now, at a Lyon that has rebuilt itself over the scars. The sun is shining on the Rhone. Students sit on the quay, their legs dangling over the water, books open on their laps. They are reading Sartre and Camus. They are debating the nature of existence, the structure of society, the logic of history. They look so serious, so intense in their academic pursuit. I envy them. I envy their belief that the world can be understood through text and theory. My university was a damp attic. My dissertation was written in dots and dashes while death hammered at the door. I can no longer find comfort in their books. When I open a volume of philosophy, the words swim on the page. I do not see arguments or syllogisms. I see the chaotic static of the atmosphere. I see the fragility of reason against the brute force of a boot on a door. The war ended for the world in 1945, but the radio never truly turned off for me. Even now, in the quiet of my living room, if a radiator hisses or a car backfires in the street, I am back there. My hand twitches, tapping out a message on the arm of my chair. I am waiting for the confirmation. I am waiting for the boots. The intellect I once prized is useless against these reflexes. The scholar is forever subservient to the survivor. This memory is a shard of glass I carry. Help me pull it out. Subscribe to keep this history alive.